Hey guys, tonight we step into the biting cold of a northern winter, the kind that makes your eyelashes freeze and your teeth chatter in perfect Viking rhythm. You trudge along a snow-drifted path, the sky overhead dim and sulking like it's about to lecture you about frostbite. Around you rise the edges of a Viking outpost, low timber buildings with sod roofs, smoke trailing from their chimneys in curling sighs. And everywhere, feathers. Not flapping, flying birds, just their remnants. Woven into cloaks, tucked into boots, stuffed into walls, they float in the air like lazy snowflakes that forgot how to fall. Feathers were the secret weapon of Norse survival, not just soft and warm, but waterproof, breathable, and surprisingly light. Forget Canada Goose jackets. Your life right now depends on a quilted tunic stuffed with bird down and stitched between layers of linen and wool. Without it, you'd be an icicle with a beard. And I hate to break it to you, but Viking winters didn't care how brave you were. No insulation, no second chances. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your city and local time in the comments. I love seeing where my sleepy history travelers are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You press forward through the chill, boots crunching the frost. Your breath clouds the air like a dragon that gave up on fire. Ahead, a man stands outside a longhouse, shaking out what looks like a cloak made of shredded clouds. He's testing the seams, thumping it against his thigh, watching stray down float into the wind. That's not just a fashion choice, it's a matter of survival. This cloak, lined with eiderdown, is the result of weeks of work. Feathers don't just magically arrange themselves into insulation. They're gathered, sorted, dried, fluffed. And not all feathers are created equal. The outer ones, too stiff. The wrong shape? Toss them. The wrong bird? Might as well wear a fish. Historians still argue whether Viking use of feathers began as a survival necessity or a prestige marker. Maybe both. What we do know is that these northern folks had no intention of freezing quietly. They adapted, layer by clever layer, using the land's strangest materials in the smartest ways. Inside the longhouse, the glow of the hearth reflects off walls lined with woven reed mats and, yes, bundles of feathers tucked into crevices to block out drafts. You duck your head under a low beam and step in. The air is thick with the scent of smoke and boiled fish, but it's warm. Immediately warmer. You loosen your cloak and glance around. Several cloaks hang near the door, each stitched from patchwork cloth, their linings spilling soft down like stuffing from a torn pillow. You plop onto a bench, the cushion beneath you suspiciously puffy. Lift the corner, and, of course, feathers. Sit too hard, and you might just disappear into it. A few children skitter by, each wrapped like plump turnips in layered garments with tiny feathery bulges at the collar and cuffs. One wears a hood that looks like it was made from a bird's nest turned inside out. And the jokes you're hearing from the adults? Even more feathered. Someone says, "Your cloak's so light, it'll fly away before spring." Another fires back. "That's fine. My sleeves are already trying to migrate south." As the night darkens, you begin to realize feathers aren't just for fashion or warmth. They're a language. A kind of quiet communication among Norse folk about who prepares well, who values their home's comfort, who can endure. You see how prized the feather-lined tunics are. They're handled gently, folded with care, passed down from elder to child. Some even bear carved bone clasps in bird shapes, ravens, eiders, even swans, perhaps invoking protection or just flexing a little midwinter style. Oh, and here's a fringe tidbit. Some sagas whisper that a cloak made from the feathers of 9 different birds could shield you from betrayal. Makes you wonder what kind of poultry politics were happening in those households. Outside, the wind kicks up again, rattling a wooden shutter. One of the elders mutters, "Storm's got sharp teeth tonight." You pull your cloak tighter, feel the softness hug your skin, and you get it. In this world, feathers mean you live to see the thaw. There's a quiet comfort to it. The way these materials, scavenged from cliffs and coasts, become armor. Not against blades, but against a slower, crueler foe. One that gnaws at fingers, toes, and spirits. And yet, as you listen to the soft thud of snow piling on the roof, you wonder how much of this innovation was born of desperate necessity, and how much was clever indulgence. Did someone one day just say, "Hey, this bird's backside is so soft. What if we wore it?" Or did it take generations of trial, frostbite, and freezing nights to discover the magic of down? Historians still debate whether Vikings stumbled onto feather insulation by accident or whether it was borrowed from earlier Arctic cultures. Some point to Sami practices with bird skins. Others argue feathers were independently discovered as a byproduct of nesting season. You'll hear both around the fire, depending on who's talking. One last detail before we move on. Don't imagine all this feather use as some elegant, tidy process. Viking homes were messy. Feathers stuck to everything: cloaks, hands, soup bowls. Kids probably sneezed more than they spoke. But no one cared, because in a world where warmth was gold, feathers were currency. And tonight, you're wrapped in a fortune. You wake to the sound of seabirds screaming at each other like grumpy fishermen who've run out of coffee. The sun is barely more than a glow behind a curtain of clouds, and your breath still hangs thick in the air. But today you've got a job: collecting feathers. And not just any feathers, the warmest, softest kind. Eiderdown, the cashmere of the bird world. You trudge along a rocky path toward the cliffs, hands buried in your sleeves, a cloth sack slung across your back. Beside you, two Viking women walk with purpose, baskets strapped to their hips, eyes scanning the horizon for signs of nests. You ask if it's dangerous. One smirks. Only if you're slower than a gull. Turns out, the best down comes from eider ducks, those pudgy little birds with eyes like they're judging your fashion choices. When the nesting season comes, the females pluck down from their own chests to line their nests, creating cozy, pillowy havens for their eggs. The Vikings knew this. They waited. And once the ducks fledged and left the nests, the harvest began. You reach the cliffs just as the wind kicks up, whipping your cloak against your legs. The women lead you down a narrow slope toward a flat ledge dotted with empty nests. Each one looks like a tiny crater filled with delicate fluff, off-white, barely there, and absurdly soft. You crouch, reach in carefully, and begin scooping the down into your bag. It clings to your fingers like it wants to stay. The older woman beside you has a trick. She rubs her hands with ash from the hearth before gathering. It dulls the static and keeps the fluff from escaping. You try it. It helps. Kind of. The gulls circling overhead, however, are not helpful. One dive bombs you. You yelp. The younger woman laughs. "You'll learn," she says. Quirky fact time. Vikings actually believed eider ducks were partially magical. Not just because they nested on cliff faces that seemed impossible to reach, but because their feathers resisted wet and cold better than anything else they'd tried. Some called them sea swans. And while it's hard to prove, a few surviving sagas mention feather picking as an almost sacred ritual, done only with clean hands and quiet voices. You move along the cliff, reaching nest after nest. The wind stings your cheeks, but your cloak keeps you surprisingly warm. Thanks, birds. The process is slow, meditative, and weirdly satisfying. One nest at a time. One handful of softness after another. Every now and then, someone shouts from above when they spot a still-occupied nest. You steer clear. Rule number 1. Never disturb an active nest. You're stealing, not committing war crimes. A gull lands near you, beady eyes locked on your sack. You pause. "Mine," you say? It blinks. And poops. You take the hint and keep moving. Back at the village, the haul is poured out onto a stretched linen sheet. The down looks like someone shaved a cloud. But it's not ready yet. Not even close. The feathers are still full of grit and tiny barbs that'll poke through clothing if not removed. You watch as 3 women sit cross-legged by the hearth and begin the sorting. They pluck out the quills, flick away the dirt, fluff the rest between their fingers. One of them hands you a pile and grins. Your turn. You sit. It's not glamorous. Your fingers ache after just a few minutes. The down clings to your tunic. Your nose itches. You sneeze. A small cloud of feathers floats up like a dandelion exploded in your lap. Everyone laughs. But there's something mesmerizing about the repetition. Pull, flick, fluff. Pull, flick, fluff. As you work, you overhear the women trading stories. How last year the wind knocked over 3 baskets of feathers right into the fjord. How once a fox raided a stash and made itself the softest den in history. Historians still argue whether Vikings gathered feathers from wild birds like eiders or if they domesticated waterfowl specifically for this purpose. Some evidence suggests small-scale semi-domestication, leaving nest boxes near settlements, protecting favored birds from predators. Others think the whole system was more opportunistic. Whichever's true, it worked. Because the Vikings didn't freeze, and you're proof of that right now, sitting cozy in a tunic padded with cloud fluff. As the sun finally dips behind the mountains, a young boy runs in from the cold, holding a tiny pouch. He dumps it into the shared pile. More down. Collected from the reeds by the river, where smaller birds nest. Not as prized as eiderdown, but every bit helps. Feathers are like firewood, someone murmurs. Never enough when winter bites. A fringe belief floats up in the room, whispered by one of the elders near the fire. Some say feathers carry the warmth of the bird's last breath. That each one remembers flight, and the act of wrapping yourself in them invites that memory close to your skin. Not science, but something about it feels right. You lean back against the log wall, fingers dusted with softness, and think. In a world before radiators and thermal wear, this was high-tech. This was engineering. This was comfort, carved out of nature's leftovers. And maybe that's what makes it feel so human. Taking the gentlest thing a bird offers, and using it to fight off the cruelest cold the earth can throw your way. You wake in the longhouse again, but this time, instead of being wrapped in just a cloak, you're getting dressed like a proper Viking. And dressing, as you quickly discover, is not a casual affair, it's a strategy. A daily battle plan against frost, dampness, and the kind of cold that makes your bones feel politely offended. You pull on your first layer, underdrawers made of coarse linen that scratch in places you'd rather not talk about. But these are just the beginning. Next comes a woolen tunic. It's heavy, itchy, and smells faintly of sheep. You'd complain, but then comes the magic, the feather layer. Two women help you into a quilted vest, linen outside, feathers in the middle, stitched tight in long, careful rows. You can feel the difference immediately. It doesn't heat you up like fire. It hugs you like steam. A soft, constant warmth, feather memory pressed against your skin. This is the famous Viking feather sandwich. And it's genius. Feathers go in the middle, between two sturdy fabrics. The outer layer blocks wind, the inner one catches sweat, and the feathers? They trap the heat like a greedy little dragon hoarding every degree of warmth. It's insulation without bulk, lightweight, quiet, and, if stitched right, water-resistant enough to take a light snowstorm without crying. Historians still argue how widespread this layering technique was. Some believe it was limited to elite families or coastal traders. Others point to archaeological impressions, seam marks, stitching holes, feather traces in burial sites, and say it was more common than we realize. The debate's still fluffier than the down itself. Anyway, you're not done. After the vest comes the tunic, then the outer tunic, then the trousers. Yes, they get feather treatment too, just around the thighs and calves, where the chill bites hardest. The trick, you're told, is to leave the knees a little freer. Too much padding there, and you'll walk like a stuffed scarecrow trying to run from a goose. You slip into a pair of thick woolen socks, lined with, you guessed it, more feathers. One of them escapes and drifts to the floor, where a toddler promptly grabs it and tries to eat it. Someone laughs and mutters. First tooth will come in feathered. Boots come next. They're made of reindeer hide, stitched with sinew, and yes, padded around the ankles with bird fluff. You don't walk in these so much as glide, your footsteps muffled by 100 birds whispering shhh with every step. Outside, the day is overcast, but you hardly notice. You're swaddled in layers that make your entire body feel like it's under a heavy, affectionate blanket. The world's still cold, but you're winning. You join a group of villagers assembling in the square. Some are dressed like you, plumped and padded like moving haystacks. Others wear simpler wraps, but all have feather accents. A collar here, a hood there, linings hidden beneath cloaks. It's a quiet fashion war. Those with more feathers walk straighter. Their breath is less visible. Their smiles linger longer. You can tell who's cold just by watching how often they shift weight. You glance over and see a young woman adjusting the shoulder seam of her tunic. It's quilted with small diamond shapes, each one stuffed with down and sewn shut. She tells you it's to prevent the feathers from clumping to one side during movement. Otherwise, she smirks, you end up warm on the left and frozen on the right. Some garments even have removable feather pouches, early Viking modular fashion. If it gets too hot, you can slide them out. Too cold? Add another one. It's like winter Legos. Quirky note here. One surviving saga describes a trader arriving in Novgorod wearing what he claimed was an entire swan's worth of feathers in his cloak. Whether that was a boast or a complaint, no one knows. But given the size of swans, we'll assume he waddled into town like an armored pillow. Later, as you crouch by the fire, a man beside you leans in. Not all feathers are equal, he whispers. Crow feathers? Bad luck. Greasy too. Duck down's good. But eider is gold. He rubs his fingers together. Weighs nothing. Keeps everything. You sip something hot, herbs and fish broth, suspiciously warm, and look down at your clothes. You never realized just how much thought went into keeping people from dying of cold. Every stitch has meaning. Every puff of down has purpose. And suddenly, the idea of primitive Vikings feels laughably wrong. These people were engineers, thermal strategists, masters of the cozy arts. There's even a quiet culture to how things are worn. You notice older villagers fold their cuffs inward, trapping more heat. Children get stitched hoods, shaped like bird heads for fun and function. Warriors wear lighter layers under their armor, with feather padding sewn into gaps. Less bulk, more freedom. And sometimes, it's about memory too. A man nearby holds out his cloak and points to a patch near the collar. My mother stitched this from her favorite goose, he says. The one that used to chase our dog. He chuckles. Still chasing us, I suppose. A few moments later, someone begins patching a sleeve. The process is delicate, plucking out the worn feathers, slipping in new ones, resealing the seam with beeswax threaded stitches. Maintenance is survival. There's no waste. No fast fashion here. You lie back on a pile of pelts as the sky darkens. Around you, feathers settle into silence. The tunic hugs you with invisible wings. And for just a moment, as your breath slows and the wind whistles outside, you wonder if this is what it felt like to be a bird in a nest, tucked into something soft, safe, and ancient. The sky has turned that odd, iron gray, somewhere between late morning and early afternoon, where the sun can't be bothered to do its job. You're standing at the shore, boots half sunk into frozen sand, as a longship rocks gently nearby. It's lean, sharp, and elegant, the Viking war chariot of the sea. But here's what you weren't expecting: feathers. Not just on the cloaks of the crew, but tucked, stuffed, and crammed into strange places aboard the ship itself. You step aboard, one hand gripping the icy edge of the hull. A sailor nods and pulls you in. He's bundled head to toe, of course, with feather-lined sleeves poking out like overstuffed sausages. His beard is frozen at the tips. His boots crunch with frost, but his smile? That's warm. That's what feathers do. They let you smile when the sea wants to slap it off your face. The ship smells of pine tar and salt, with a faint undertone of, well, poultry. You walk along the center line, careful not to slip. Between the planks, you notice something odd, tufts of down poking up from the cracks. A sailor catches your puzzled glance. Keeps water out, he grunts. Stuffed in with moss and pitch. Insulates the floor. Turns out, feather insulation wasn't just for tunics. Vikings lined the undersides of ship benches and wrapped their precious gear, clothing, food, even scrolls, in feather-packed leather rolls to keep them from freezing solid. You reach down and tap the floor. Springy, like someone built a boat on top of a mattress. There's a canvas tent pitched near the stern. You duck inside. It's the captain's quarters, and it's practically a nest. Cloaks hang from pegs, each one quilted and heavy with down. A bedroll lies spread over a wooden crate, puffed up like it's about to levitate. And near the edges of the tent, bird feathers shoved into every corner, wedged into seams, layered between the tent fabric and a second interior hide. No drafts getting in here. This is first-class Viking travel. The captain emerges from the shadows. He's older, thickly wrapped, his hands gnarled like driftwood. He pats his cloak. 17 birds, he says with pride. Only lost 2 feathers in last month's storm. You're not sure if that's impressive or mildly disturbing. But here's your quirky tidbit. Some Viking captains supposedly named their cloaks. Not after warriors or gods, but after birds. Rafn's wing. Sigurd's nest. There's even one record of a trader naming his cloak Feather Wife, because, as he put it, she keeps me warmer and argues less. You sit beside a barrel and let your hand drift across a stack of feather-wrapped bundles. Some of these contain dried fish. Others, Fire starting kits. The feathers aren't just insulation. They're shock absorbers. When the ship crashes into a wave, and oh, it does, you bounce rather than bruise. Genius. Historians still debate just how widespread this feather insulation practice was aboard ships. Some argue the longships were too wet, too open for feathers to be practical. But others point to remnants found in coastal wrecks. Feather remains sealed in tar, faint impressions in preserved bedding rolls, even fragments of quilts stuck in anchor crates. More common than we think, one archaeologist said. Less glamorous than gold, but far more useful when you're freezing. A gust hits the sail above, and the ship creaks. You glance over and see one of the younger sailors clutching a roll of what looks like leather, tied tight with twine. He unrolls it briefly and shows you his boots, his mittens, his scarf. All feather-lined, all dry, all warm. He rolls it back up like it's treasure and tucks it beneath a fur covering. "Don't let the salt in," he mutters. Out at sea, things are even harsher. You remember someone saying earlier, the sea eats heat. You didn't get it then. You do now. Cold doesn't just sit still out here. It hunts. It creeps up your legs, squeezes behind your eyes, slides down your neck. But the feathers hold it back. They push it out. Every down-filled seam on your body is like a tiny, silent soldier standing guard. The ship cuts through the waves, and mist rises around you. You huddle against the mast and glance across the boat. There, wrapped in their cloaks, the crew rests like birds tucked under wing. Some even have feather-stuffed cushions lashed to the benches beneath them, their backs leaning against quilted sacks. Sleep is possible out here, but only if you nest well. One man, half asleep, murmurs, "Storm's coming." Another groans and rolls over, feathers puffing up around his face. "Then tell it we're busy." A scholar once noted that Viking survival depended as much on textile strategy as on swordsmanship. Watching this ship now, you believe it. It's not just about getting somewhere. It's about getting there alive, dry, and not permanently frostbitten. The day ends early, as it always does up north. The horizon blurs. Someone lights a small lantern and props it inside a horn casing to stop the wind. The golden glow flickers, catching on a single feather drifting through the air. You watch it fall slowly, lazily, as if the cold forgot how to pull. You curl up in a dry corner, wrapped in layers that crinkle softly with every shift. And as the longship rocks gently beneath you, and the cold sighs just beyond your sleeve, you close your eyes, wrapped in the warmth of something ancient, something light, something alive once, and now still keeping you safe on the sea. The longship docks just before dusk, sliding into a sheltered inlet like a beast returning to its cave. You disembark stiff-legged but warm, your feather-lined garments doing their job a little too well. You're sweating now, which in Viking terms means you're practically tropical. Ahead sprawls a coastal settlement built more around barter than beauty. It's noisy, cluttered, and smells unmistakably of salted fish, wood smoke, and wet wool. You step over a puddle, possibly seawater, possibly something less poetic, and follow the crowd toward the marketplace. But this isn't your average loud haggling, elbow-shoving trading scene. Here, the currency isn't always silver or fish. It's fluff, literal fluff. You approach a stall where bundles of feathers sit piled like oddly deflated pastries. Behind the counter, a wiry man with windburned cheeks and eyebrows thick enough to knit with leans over. "Soft or softer?" he asks, holding up 2 samples. You touch both. One feels like air whispered through butter. The other feels like air whispered through expensive butter. He nods. Eider, plucked after nesting. No blood, no stink. Just gold you can wear. Feathers, it turns out, were a booming side hustle in many Viking coastal towns. Gatherers brought them in by the bag. Merchants weighed and sorted them, and traders took them by ship to distant ports. Bergen, Hedeby, even as far south as Dublin, there were markets for luxury warmth. And this wasn't just survival gear anymore. It was status. Quirky little aside. Some Viking nobles were buried with feather-filled pillows under their heads, but not necessarily for comfort. Symbolically, the softness was thought to cushion the journey to the next world. One rune stone inscription even references the downbed of heroes, which either meant literal bedding or a very oddly worded metaphor. You spot a young woman nearby browsing through cloaks. She pulls one on, stretches her arms, and fluffs the shoulders like she's testing flight capacity. The stall owner grins. Royal weave. Goose outer, eider inner. Try falling asleep in that. You'll miss spring. You wander deeper into the market. There are traders selling everything from feathered hats to insulated foot wraps. One even hawks quill mittens, lined with fluff but finished with decorative wing feathers stitched to the back. Completely impractical. Absolutely stylish. A group of men haggle over a padded travel blanket, their voices rising like gulls fighting over breadcrumbs. It's short, one yells. You're short, the merchant snaps back. Buy two and sew them end to end. Business thrives. You pause at a booth displaying what looks like bolts of linen stacked high, but each one is pre-quilted, stuffed with feather layers between. This is the raw material for tailors. The Viking version of technical fabric. A man unrolls one and shows you the careful diamond stitching meant to hold the feathers in place. Trade secret, he whispers. Won't clump. Won't crawl. Best stitch in 2 kingdoms. Historians still argue whether feather-based textiles were developed solely in the north or if Vikings borrowed some techniques from contacts in Eastern Europe or the Byzantine world. After all, feathers were valued across many ancient cultures. Egyptians used them in fans. Persians lined ceremonial cloaks, and the Romans? Well, they used goose grease and hoped for the best. But here, in this northern outpost, the feather trade is serious business. Some families earn more from collecting, sorting, and selling feathers than from fishing. Feathers are light, packable, and absurdly valuable. One merchant tells you that a sack of pure eiderdown, properly cleaned, is worth more than a full-grown goat. You glance at your cloak, then at the goats nearby. They definitely look jealous. You pass a stall where a trader proudly unrolls a scroll covered in feather tallies. It lists bundles bought, weights, quality grades, each with a rune mark beside it. Feather trade required bureaucracy, too. Welcome to Norse spreadsheets. Another stall catches your eye. The merchant is older, bent with years, and her goods are different. Feather amulets, small sewn pouches, and even braided necklaces with down inside tiny hide tubes. She calls them storm charms, protection from shipwreck, frostbite, or heartbreak, depending on who you ask. You ask, heartbreak, she says deadpan, but only if it's feathered heartbreak. She holds up one necklace. This one, sea duck breast down, keeps you safe from cold and from lovers who leave without saying goodbye. You don't buy it, but you also don't put it down immediately, just in case. As the sun dips behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the marketplace, you realize how central feathers have become, not just for survival, but as symbols of identity, class, and community. Traders brag about their rarest fluff the way nobles show off jewelry. Gatherers compete for the best nesting cliffs, and tailors guard their stitching techniques like dragons hoarding secrets. A shout breaks the calm. A boy sprints through the square, a cloud of feathers exploding from a torn sack on his back. Everyone laughs, even the merchant chasing him. The down flutters in the air, glowing in the amber torchlight like snow in slow motion. You catch one on your sleeve. It clings there, light as breath. You brush it off, tuck your hands into your warm, ridiculous, glorious tunic, and head back to the longhouse. Behind you, the marketplace dims. Ahead, your bedroll waits, padded with more down than you could ever count. By morning, the marketplace is silent again, save for the occasional gull cry and the sleepy murmur of traders boiling stale ale for breakfast. But today you're staying indoors, or at least indoors by Viking standards. You duck through the low threshold of the longhouse once more, blinking as your eyes adjust to the warm gloom. The hearth glows at the center, its flickering light revealing what you hadn't noticed yesterday. The longhouse is practically held together by feathers. Okay, maybe not literally, but give it a few more snowstorms, and you wouldn't be surprised. You settle onto a bench layered with animal pelts. Beneath them, more feathers. Of course. The seat puffs slightly as you shift your weight. Across the room, a woman is stuffing the gaps between timber planks with a mix of moss, wool scraps, and, yep, down. She does it deftly, using a thin stick to push the materials deep into every drafty crevice. North wind's no joke, she says without turning. Doesn't knock, just walks in. Longhouses, while sturdy, weren't exactly airtight. The roof might be thatched or covered in turf, but the walls were often just rough timber or wattle and daub. Good for keeping out rain, not great for holding in heat. So, Feathers played a backup role. They were crammed into window ledges, door frames, even packed under floorboards. The more gaps you filled, the fewer times you woke up thinking your toes had turned to ice cubes. You stroll deeper into the space. The air smells of baked bread, smoked fish, and something faintly gamey. A low sleeping platform runs along the far wall. It's covered with what looks like an enormous fur rug, but when you poke it, the softness gives way to something airier. Underneath, quilted feather-stuffed pads have been laid across the wood. Homemade mattresses, Viking edition. The best ones, someone explains, have a two-layer system, straw or dried reeds on the bottom for support, then the feather layer on top for warmth and comfort. You lie down experimentally and instantly sink a little. It's not quite a feather bed from Versailles, but compared to a bare floor, it's basically a spa. A girl nearby is helping her grandmother repair one of the sleeping pads. They tug out clumped feathers, beat them lightly between wooden paddles, and refill the seams. The old woman chuckles as she works. If you can't sleep, blame your feathers. Too tight, and they poke. Too loose, and you drown. Historians still argue whether feather bedding was a widespread domestic custom or a luxury of wealthier homes. The preservation of organic materials is spotty at best in Viking-era archaeology, but some digs have uncovered linen fragments stuffed with fibrous materials, including what could be feather remains. And certain sagas describe beds so soft, warriors sank like spring lambs into cloud. You're handed a cup of something warm and weirdly chunky. It's a mix of herbs and barley, heated near the fire. You sip carefully while watching a boy tug a feather-padded curtain across a doorway. Privacy was rare in longhouses, but that curtain? It also stops drafts from slithering in like nosy ghosts. Feathers weren't limited to sleeping spaces, either. Cooking areas had overhead hoods, simple wooden frames draped in fabric, with feathers packed inside to trap smoke and heat. One woman points out a spot near the hearth where food storage jars are nestled in straw and down to prevent freezing. You want to eat dry peas in February? Then keep them cozy. Even tools were feathered, in a sense. Some handles, especially for cold weather gear like scythes or carving knives, were wrapped in strips of cloth stuffed with down to prevent frostbite. Gloves existed, sure, but they weren't always enough. Sometimes a feather pad wrapped with leather cord was the difference between dexterity and disaster. And then there are the walls. One section of the longhouse has a decorative panel, linen embroidered with knot patterns, colored threads looping into stylized birds and vines. Behind it, more insulation. The panel isn't just for show. It hides layers of feathers tucked in like hidden treasure. It's the quiet warmth, someone tells you. Better than fire. Fire makes smoke. Feathers don't complain. You glance around. Every corner has some puff of down peeking out. Someone even shows you a hand warmer. Two flat pouches stitched together, filled with dry herbs and feathers. You slip your fingers in. It's absurdly effective. The herbs smell faintly of sage and salt. You can't help but think it would sell like crazy at a modern Christmas market. Here's a fringe detail for you. Some folks believe that feathers packed into the walls could trap bad spirits. The logic went that spirits, being cold themselves, would nest in the soft warmth and fall asleep, unable to harm the household. Superstitious? Maybe. But as you watch an old man press a handful of down into a wall crack and mutter a prayer, it doesn't feel silly. It feels like someone preparing for war with winter and with whatever else might come creeping in. As evening falls, someone lights a few oil lamps. The longhouse dims, glows amber, and hums with quiet activity. Children roll feather-stuffed sleeves into tight bundles to use as pillows. An elder leans back, his cloak tucked like a second skin, and exhales a slow breath. The woman who'd been stuffing the wall finishes her task, then leans on her stick, smiling at the completed patch. When the wind howls tonight, she says, it'll have to howl somewhere else. And as you wrap yourself in your cloak, lying down in a bed that's more feather than frame, you realize these houses weren't just built from wood and stone. They were woven from survival, stitch by stitch, feather by feather. The Vikings didn't just endure winter. They outsmarted it. Silently, softly, one downy secret at a time. You wake to the sound of soft hiccups. Not yours. A baby's. Tiny, almost musical, like a sleepy bird learning to sing. You're still lying on the feather mattress in the longhouse, and as your eyes adjust, you notice a small bundle swaddled near the hearth. The baby is cocooned in layers upon layers of cloth, fur, and, of course, feathers. The mother, young and serene despite having slept maybe 4 minutes total, sits close by, gently rocking the little one with a feather-wrapped sling draped across her lap. Keeps the damp out, she says, not looking up. Feathers hold the heat. You sit up slowly, careful not to startle either of them. The fire pops and hisses. The light flickers, and you begin to realize that for Viking infants, warmth wasn't just a matter of comfort. It was survival. Winter killed, and it especially liked the youngest. Infant mortality in the Viking Age was high. Some estimates suggest nearly 1 in 4 children didn't survive their first year. Feathers, humble as they seem, were part of a quiet resistance against that grim statistic. They were tucked into cradle boards, sewn into baby tunics, even used to fill soft collars to protect the tiny gap between neck and shoulder from bitter wind. The cradle you're now examining isn't some ornate wooden heirloom. It's simple, a carved trough with padded sides. Inside, a feather mattress no bigger than a shield, shaped to cradle a body still learning how to exist in the world. On top of the baby lies a thin cloth, stitched along the edges and filled with down, so light it barely seems real. A mother nearby smiles. Eider feathers only. Goose is too stiff. Swan is too proud. You don't ask what she means. It's probably best that way. She offers you a small packet, a baby warmer. It's a linen pouch filled with warm stones wrapped in feathers, meant to be tucked near the infant's feet. The pouch smells of mint and cedar. You hold it for a moment. The weight is almost nothing, but the warmth lingers. Quirky aside, some Viking families apparently used feathers as a primitive diapering aid, not for absorption, but as a liner to keep moisture from clinging to cloth. You're not entirely sure how that worked, and no one here seems willing to explain in detail. Probably because they know you'll never look at a feather the same way again. You glance around and notice another child, perhaps 3 years old, sitting quietly on a stool, bundled in what looks like a miniature snowsuit. It's a full-body tunic, quilted and stuffed, with only the face peeking out like a turnip wrapped in pastry. The child holds a carved toy boat and makes soft whooshing sounds as they push it across the floor. A grandmother speaks as she tends to a stack of children's clothes, layering new feathers into tiny hoods. First winter is test of fate, she says. Second winter is test of mother. Third winter? That one's yours. You nod, not entirely understanding, but feeling the weight of it anyway. Historians still debate how structured Viking child-rearing was, especially during early infancy. Some accounts suggest children were swaddled tightly and kept indoors for most of the first few months. Others believe babies were exposed to the elements early to toughen them up. The truth probably lived somewhere between. Warmth first, bravery later. You're handed a needle and a strip of cloth. The task? So shut a tiny quilt square meant for a baby sling. The process is delicate. The feathers try to escape. They float up like tiny spirits, each one weightless but stubborn. The women laugh at your attempts. You sew like a fisherman. That's a compliment. No. Once finished, the quilt square is layered onto the inside of the sling. The goal is simple: trap body heat, avoid sweat, and prevent frostbite. The craftsmanship is quietly impressive. No wasted material. Every stitch tight. The babies here might not have silver spoons, but they do have feather wraps that could rival modern sleeping bags. Later, you're shown a lullaby cloth. It's not for warmth, it's for quiet. A thin linen blanket, lightly filled with down, meant to be laid gently across the child's chest to simulate the pressure of a parent's arm. Like being held, someone whispers. It's an emotional moment, surprisingly. In this rugged world of axes and storms and survival, this delicate attention to softness is profoundly moving. A young mother points to a string of feathers hanging near the door. They're colored, arranged in a fan, each tied with a different thread. From each first feather, she says, "They're baby feather. We keep it. Hang it. Remind them where they came from." Fringe belief alert. Some Vikings believed the soul was tied to breath, and feathers, being from birds, held wind and sky in their structure. Thus, wrapping a baby in feathers wasn't just about insulation. It was symbolic. A gesture that connected the newborn to air, spirit, and something greater than themselves. You're handed one last thing before leaving. A tiny boot, barely the size of your fist. Inside, stuffed with feathers, stitched with care. A baby's first winter step, softened by 1,000 wings. As the infant by the hearth finally dozes off, wrapped in that impossibly soft down sling, you realize you haven't once seen them shiver. In a world where fire can only reach so far, feathers pick up the slack. And when it comes to Viking babies, the lesson is simple. If the world outside is cruel and cold, then you wrap them in the softest things you have. And maybe, just maybe, they'll live to see the spring. The sky is slate-colored again by late afternoon, and the snow has started falling in that slow, sideways way that means it's not in a hurry to stop. You step carefully across the slippery ground as you follow an older man toward the edge of the settlement. He walks with the slow, deliberate rhythm of someone who knows every stone beneath the snow. Over his shoulder, he carries a bundle, tightly wrapped in linen and stitched shut with black wool thread. You think it might be food, a cloak, a bedroll. It's not. It's someone. The burial ground is quiet. No fences, no stones, just shallow mounds rising gently from the whiteness. A few low wooden markers lean at awkward angles, and a wind chime made from bits of antler clicks softly in the breeze. You help dig. The frozen ground doesn't give easily. Each stroke of the spade hits like a dull drumbeat. The others don't talk much. Eventually, the pit is ready, and only then do they unwrap the bundle. Inside lies an elderly woman, face lined like a map of storms. Her hands are folded. Her eyes are closed. Around her body are layers of fabric, wool, linen, fur, and nestled directly beneath her back, like a final comfort, is a feather-stuffed pillow. Feathers in Viking burial. Oh yes, not always, not everywhere, but often enough that it can't be coincidence. The pillow is unassuming, not fancy, just a tightly stuffed shape, perhaps the size of a saddlebag, sewn with care. You watch as it's placed carefully beneath the woman's spine, lifting her ever so slightly, as if giving her one last chance to rise. A man near you murmurs, "She flew in life. May she float in death." Quirky tidbit incoming. Some Norse texts refer to feather beds of the fallen or resting on swan wings. Whether metaphor or memory, feathers were clearly part of the Viking afterlife aesthetic. Maybe it was about elevation, literally lifting the dead off the earth, or maybe about the softness needed to cross into something gentler than this world. Historians still argue whether these burial feathers had a symbolic role or were simply practical, extra warmth to preserve the body before decomposition. But consider this. Some graves also contained feathers stitched into cloaks, even when the rest of the clothing was stripped or decayed. Feathers were chosen to stay. That means something. You notice a young woman placing a second pillow, this one smaller, more ornate, beneath the elder's knees. For long walking, she whispers. Then come the grave goods, a carved spoon, a twisted ring, a bundle of dried herbs, and, tucked into the palm, a single raven feather. Black, sharp, and perfect. It's tied with red thread. A personal token, not meant for function, but for memory. The burial is simple. The body is lowered, the cloth retied. A thin fur is placed over the whole shape. Then earth begins to fall, one handful at a time. Later, back in the longhouse, someone tells you more about the role of feathers in Viking funerals. In some regions, they say, the dead were wrapped in a cloak lined with down, so the cold won't follow them. Others mention burial shrouds sewn with gull feathers to help carry souls over water. Whether myth or fact, you begin to see how deeply these people believed in the quiet power of the feather. There's an odd superstition, too. It's said that if a feather drifts across your face while you're sleeping, someone has just passed into the next world. Comforting or creepy? You decide. Someone brings out a memory quilt next. It's a patchwork square of linen and stitched leather, filled with mixed feathers from across the household. Each section bears a small embroidered rune. Names, dates, tokens of those who've gone before. It's draped over laps during funerals, passed from hand to hand, warmed by tears and body heat. You hold it for a while. It's heavy, not from weight, but from the quiet ache of a dozen goodbyes woven into fabric. And here's a subtle layer of Viking practicality. Feathers are biodegradable, and in many of the older burial mounds, all that remains of these once elaborate feather wraps are faint impressions, shadowed lines in the soil, and, in rare cases, a few preserved quills. But those marks are enough to tell the story. Enough to say, they were cared for. Even at the end, the fire crackles louder than usual tonight. Someone's singing, a low, drifting melody with no clear words. You lie down on your now familiar feather mattress, staring at the ceiling beams. You think of the elder's face, serene and still. You think of the pillow beneath her, the one soft gesture given when everything else must go. It doesn't take much to comfort a soul. Sometimes just a handful of feathers, tucked beneath a back, tied to a wrist, sewn into a final cloak. And maybe, as the snow falls silently on a fresh grave outside, that softness carries more than warmth. Maybe it carries memory. Maybe it carries peace. Morning brings a new kind of chill, the kind that doesn't bite, but stares. You know it's there. You feel it in your teeth and in your thoughts. The kind of cold that doesn't need wind to be cruel. You sip something hot near the hearth and wrap your cloak tighter, already thankful for the down stitched inside the collar. But as you run your fingers over the seams, feeling for the telltale softness of feathers beneath fabric, a question forms. One you've heard whispered more than once on this journey. Did Vikings wear feather-stuffed garments just to survive? Or did they, at some point, start doing it because it looked, well, kind of impressive? You walk out to the edge of the village and find a woman kneeling beside a half-finished tunic. The fabric is dyed a deep blue, woven with wool so tight, it almost shines. She's sewing feather pockets into the lining, not for bulk warmth, but in narrow, deliberate channels that trace the shape of the shoulders and chest. It looks like it belongs to a chieftain or a merchant with opinions. Is it warm, you ask? She shrugs. Warm enough, but mostly it wears well. There it is. Fashion. Even among the practical-minded Norse, vanity finds a way. Quirky detail. There's one preserved feather cloak. Well, fragments of one, from a grave near Birka in Sweden. Archaeologists believe it was decorative as much as functional, perhaps used in rituals or ceremonial appearances. It was layered with white bird feathers, not hidden in seams, but fanned out across the shoulders like wings. Someone wanted to be seen. You stroll toward the communal hall, where several men are gathered around a tunic display. Yes, that's a thing now. Apparently, traders from abroad have brought fabrics with feather linings stitched in diamond patterns so ornate they look quilted by royal birds. One man holds up a sleeve and whistles. Even the seams are smug, he mutters. The others nod in agreement. Feather use became a kind of cultural signal, subtle but noticeable. Quilted padding in your tunic? You're clever. Matching feather-lined boots and gloves? You're prepared. Feather stitch trim on your cloak in a color that matches your eyes? You're making a statement. Historians still argue whether feather-adorned garments were everyday wear or festival attire. Some believe such items were saved for ceremonies, blots, weddings, trade journeys. Others say the layering was standard, but that only wealthier individuals could afford the extra stitching and rare bird down. As you sit near a window, you spot a teenage boy adjusting the lacing on his feather-lined vest. His fingers move quickly, smoothing the fabric until it lies just right. His reflection in a bronze tray says he's not checking for fit. He's checking for flair. Meanwhile, a girl enters wearing a cloak lined with feathers on the outside. They're pressed flat and dyed, a reddish hue that catches the firelight. Her brother scoffs, but she only smirks. They'll remember me. And they probably will. There's a theory that feathered accessories, especially shoulder wraps or collars, were sometimes used to mimic animal traits. A touch of swan elegance, raven cunning, or eagle authority. You've heard these metaphors before. But here, it's more literal. People are wearing their animals. One elder, seated in the corner and sipping honeyed ale, raises an eyebrow when asked about it. Function becomes form, he says. When the thing that saves you also makes you look good, you keep doing it. You turn over a pair of gloves nearby. The lining is pure eiderdown, stitched beneath a thin layer of wool. But someone's taken the time to embroider tiny birds onto the cuffs. You can't tell if it's pride, tradition, or just boredom. Maybe all three. A group of younger villagers gather near the hearth, comparing cloaks. One girl lifts hers and shows the inner pattern, a quilted star stitched with gold thread. Another pulls out a feather-wrapped belt buckle, completely unnecessary, but delightful. It's clear that what started as insulation has turned into art, and yet, not everyone agrees. You overhear a quiet debate between two older weavers. The young one's waist feathers on show, one says. Better sewn into sleeves than stitched to look like stars. But isn't warmth more than temperature? The other replies. They walk taller in those cloaks. That counts. The discussion fades into the background hum of the longhouse, but it stays with you. The tension between survival and self-expression, between function and flair. Vikings, after all, weren't just rugged farmers and battle-scarred raiders. They were poets, traders, makers, people who carved dragon heads onto ships not because it helped them sail better, but because it looked glorious crashing through the waves. Maybe feathers followed the same arc. First, they kept you alive. Then, they made you feel alive. You step outside again as the snow begins to thicken. A boy runs past you wearing a tunic with feather cuffs that flap like wings as he moves. Behind him, a group of girls trail feathers on woven cords in their braids. Nothing practical about it, just beautiful. And as you turn back toward the warmth of the longhouse, you realize something. The line between necessity and decoration has always been blurry. Maybe it's not a line at all. Maybe it's a feather, light, soft, and capable of holding a little warmth and a little ego at the same time. The morning fog hasn't lifted, and everything seems wrapped in pale wool. You step out quietly, following the muffled sounds of conversation and laughter coming from one of the longhouses near the edge of the village. Inside, a circle of women sits near the hearth, knees touching, fingers busy. They're not weaving cloth today. They're sorting feathers. Lots of feathers. Piles of them, actually. Some still tinged with sea grit, others clean and puffed like pastry dough. It's not glamorous work, but it's essential. The room smells of wood smoke, seawater, and faintly birdish. The air is thick with floating bits of down, catching light like slow snowflakes. Sit. One woman gestures, patting the floor beside her. You obey. This is feather sorting, the unspoken art form, a quiet ritual of patience, precision, and a remarkable amount of sneezing. You're handed a shallow wooden tray filled with mixed feathers. The goal? Separate them by type, down versus quill, stiff versus soft, usable versus trash. You start picking through it slowly. Immediately, feathers cling to your fingertips, your sleeves, your face. One finds its way into your mouth. The woman next to you chuckles. Good. Now it knows your name. Here's a quiet truth. In most Viking households, it was women who turned raw feathers into warmth. Men might gather them. Children might play with them. But women? They cleaned, sorted, and stitched. This was a craft passed from mother to daughter, aunt to niece. Not flashy, not praised in sagas. But without it, no one made it through the winter. You watch as an older woman pulls out a pile of nearly identical feathers and somehow spots 3 that don't belong. Seagull, she mutters. They'll poke. She flicks them aside with the same finality one might swat a rude goose. Quirky tradition time. In some areas, feather sorting was done in near silence. Not out of superstition, but to keep feathers from floating away. Talking stirred the air. Silence kept the fluff grounded. Of course, today's group is chatty. You're all breathing in at least one bird per sentence. And yes, historians still argue whether feather processing was always done in domestic settings or whether there were specialized artisans or even seasonal workshops dedicated to insulation preparation. Some suggest coastal villages had feather women who specialized in just this kind of work. Others think it was simply integrated into daily life like spinning and mending. Both theories might be true. You try your best. Pick, flick, pile. But it's slow going. You find yourself daydreaming, your hands moving almost automatically. One feather, thin as breath, floats up and lands on your nose. Another sticks in your hair. You're building your own cloak. A woman jokes. Just sit long enough, and it'll form around you. Once sorted, the feathers are dried, laid on warm rocks near the hearth or left in hanging baskets suspended from the rafters. You glance up. Dozens of them sway gently, feathers stuffed like sleeping beehives. The stitching comes next. One woman opens her sewing kit. Bones in carved wood, spools of woolen thread, and needles that gleam like fish bones. She draws out a strip of cloth, 2 layers thick, and begins the process of layering feathers between them. Tiny handfuls, evenly spaced, then stitched shut with a running seam. This is the basic feather panel, the building block of all those cloaks, boots, mittens, and bedding rolls you've come to appreciate. She shows you the method. Stitch, stuff, pinch, stitch. Keep the tension even. Don't clump. Never overfill. Feathers need space to trap heat. You try it. You're clumsy. You stab your thumb. She winces in sympathy. It'll learn. You look around. Each woman has her specialty. One sorts, one stitches, one puffs feathers by hand, breaking up clumps and shaking out hidden grit. Another seals panels with waxed thread for water resistance. It's a quiet assembly line, and no one's in a rush. Winter's not leaving. There's time to do it right. Stories start to float around the circle. One woman talks about a tunic she made for her son's first sea voyage. He cried when he outgrew it, said it was softer than his pillow. Another recalls a feather cloak gifted to a bride, so well made that it still hangs in her daughter's home 30 years later. You sense the pride, low and steady, like a heartbeat. Then someone pulls out a wrapped bundle, an heirloom cloak. It's patched, fraying at the edges, but still intact. The lining is triple-stitched, the feathers holding firm. You stroke the surface. It's absurdly soft. Eider, the woman says. From a nesting island. Took 3 summers to gather enough. Fringe belief time. Some say a cloak made entirely from island-gathered down was lucky in battle. Not because it protected your body, but because it was believed to shield your soul. That kind of cloak wasn't just warmth. It was armor you couldn't see. And you get it now. This isn't just insulation. It's inheritance. Each stitch, each handful of feathers, it's a form of memory, of care passed on in loops of thread. You spend hours with them, sorting, stitching, laughing, itching. By the end of it, you've built a panel of your own. Small, slightly lumpy, definitely not waterproof. But it's yours. You hold it against your chest. It's warm. You smile. Because now you're part of it. The sea is restless today, gray, bloated with fog, and speckled with whitecaps that slap the shoreline like impatient hands. You're standing at the edge of a narrow dock, shivering slightly despite your layers. Around you, preparations are underway for something that feels bigger than a market run. Boats are being loaded, not with fish or cargo, but with bundles of cloth, stacks of baskets, and, most notably, empty sacks. Bird season, someone says behind you. Time to harvest the islands. You turn. It's the same woman from the feather sorting circle, now wrapped in a waterproof cloak and hoisting a wicker pack nearly as tall as she is. She nods toward a boat already pushing off. We go every year. Whole families. Camp there. Sleep there. Pluck there. You follow her aboard a larger craft where others are assembling. Mothers, grandfathers, teenagers, even a toddler swaddled in enough fabric to double as flotation. The mood isn't tense, but focused. This is a tradition, not an adventure. The journey to the Bird Islands takes a few hours. The sea spray is merciless, soaking your outer cloak and making you very, very grateful for the feather padding beneath it. Every wave that hits the hull sends a shudder through the boards and a chorus of grumbles from the passengers. Better birds than backaches, one man mutters, adjusting a feather cushion he's wedged under himself. Eventually, the coastline disappears behind you, replaced by a huddle of rocky islets, bare, wind-battered, and teeming with noise. The sound hits before the sight, a rising din of squawks, flaps, and what can only be described as bird yelling. Hundreds, no, thousands, of seabirds wheel above, their calls colliding in the wind like gossip on fire. The boat docks clumsily. You're handed a pack and pointed toward a slope of brittle grass and pale lichen. We nest above the nesting. A boy explains. No tents near the colonies. They remember. And so begins the harvest. You spend the next several days living in a canvas shelter reinforced with feather-stuffed panels. Yes, even here, warmth matters. Meals are simple, dried fish, hard cheese, and whatever herbs someone remembered to bring. But everything revolves around the down. At dawn, you hike to the cliffs, balancing on slippery rock paths, the wind trying to pull your hood off at every turn. Nesting spots are tucked into crevices, shallow bowls carved out by generations of eiders who, by some miracle, return to the same places each year. And the gathering? It's not stealing. Not really. You're shown how to approach the empty nests. Only after the ducklings have fledged and the mothers have flown. The down they leave behind, soft and gray, clings to the nests like whispered goodbyes. You scoop it gently, mindful not to crush or disturb the structure. Each handful is its own victory. There's a reverence to it, a hush that falls even among the youngest gatherers. No shouting, no sudden movements, just careful hands and deep respect. These birds are more than a resource. They're part of the rhythm of survival. Quirky fact, in some Norse communities, bird islands were inherited like land. Specific families returned to the same nesting spots year after year, believing the birds recognized them. And some even left small offerings, feathers tied with colored thread, fish bones arranged into spirals, as a sort of thank you. Historians still argue whether these harvests were formally organized or more free-for-all in nature. Some evidence suggests local chiefs regulated access, while others believe it was simply understood through generations of custom and cooperation. Either way, disputes were rare. No one wanted to anger the birds, or each other. At night, you sit around a small driftwood fire with the others, listening to wind and wings overhead. Someone tells a story about a man who once gathered too soon, before the ducklings had left. The next season, no birds returned to that cliff. They know, she whispers, tapping her forehead. The next morning, you wake before the sun and follow a father and daughter to a different part of the island. Here, the nests are deeper, harder to reach, tucked under ledges that require crawling and commitment. The air smells of salt and guano. It's not pleasant, but the feathers? They're perfect. You gather slowly. Your sack fills. Each handful is like catching a breath that someone else forgot to take. Later, back at the camp, everyone begins the first round of cleaning. It's basic. Shake the feathers, sift them through woven baskets, let the wind carry off the dust. It's only the beginning. Real sorting happens at home. But this is enough for now. You lie back on a feather-stuffed sleeping mat, staring at the stars poking through the sea mist. Your hands ache. Your knees are damp, but your core? Warm, soft, steady, because you know what's waiting back home. Cloaks, boots, bedding, pillows for newborns, padding for warriors, lining for boats, wrapping for the dead. All from this, the quiet harvest, the careful hands, the birds who leave a part of themselves behind and trust that you'll use it with care. You're back on solid ground again, the village rising in its usual slow rhythm. Chimneys smoking, sheep grumbling in the distance, someone chopping wood with a tempo that could pass for a heartbeat. But something's different now. There's a hush beneath the bustle, a softness that you only start noticing once your ears adjust. It's the feathers, not just in the clothing or cloaks, but in the stories. You find yourself sitting near a group of elders in the longhouse. One of them is mending a sleeve, but her hands move absently, eyes fixed on the fire. Another hums softly, then starts to speak, voice low, careful. You know about the swan maidens, don't you? She says, not looking at anyone in particular. A child perks up. They stole men and turned into stars. No, the elder says, grinning. They saved men and turned into mist. And just like that, you're swept into another layer of the feather story, folklore. In Viking legend and neighboring Norse Germanic tales, swan maidens were shapeshifters, beautiful women who wore cloaks of feathers to transform into birds. If someone stole their cloak, they couldn't fly away. Some were captured. Some fell in love. Some waited years for their feathers to be returned so they could vanish into the sky. The stories vary wildly, sometimes romantic, sometimes tragic, always feathered. But the idea stuck. Feathers became a symbol not just of warmth and protection, but of magic, escape, change. Quirky aside, in some sagas, warriors would sleep with a swan feather beneath their tongue before battle, hoping to gain swiftness, or, depending on the version, to see visions of the afterlife should they fall. One tale tells of a jarl who slept only on a pillow stuffed with raven down, convinced it gave him prophetic dreams. You're shown a small household altar, a tucked-away shelf with carved wooden birds, feathers braided into cords, and a dried wreath made from feather scraps. For the house spirits, someone says. They like softness. You glance at a bundle of feathers hanging above the door, tied in a crisscross pattern. What's that? A wind catcher, an old man answers. It tells us if the air is turning sharp, and maybe it keeps bad luck out. Some Vikings believed certain birds could guide the soul or carry it. Ravens, associated with Odin, were feared and respected. Swans were said to be spirits of the noble dead. And seabirds? Always half-wild, half-wise. Feather bundles tucked into roof beams or hearth corners weren't just insulation. They were whispers to the beyond. Historians still debate how literally such beliefs were taken. Were the feathers purely symbolic? Or did people really believe their cloaks could carry magic? The line, as always, blurs. Viking life was practical and poetic in the same breath. What warmed your body could also shield your soul. Back near the hearth, someone begins a lullaby. It's soft, rhythmic, and strangely haunting. You don't understand all the words, but you catch a few. Wing, night, safe, dream. A child curls into their mother's side, feather-stuffed head crinkling gently as they drift off. You wander the longhouse, noting more bundles tied into odd shapes. One above the sleeping alcove, braided with thread. Another hanging from a baby's cradle. One man even keeps a small feather in a carved amulet around his neck. Duck wing, he mutters. Caught it the day I met my wife. Good luck. You pause. Does it still work? He shrugs. She's still here. There's even a tale someone tells about a man who built his entire home from the bones and feathers of birds. Not for structure, but for protection. When the frost came, the storyteller says, his house breathed. It breathed for him, held the warmth in like a mother's arms. You're starting to get it. Feathers weren't just a material. They were a message, a metaphor, a promise, protection, transition, return. And you begin to notice how often the metaphors show up in speech. Light as gull down for someone lucky. Flew the nest for someone who died. Tied with crow thread for someone born under bad stars. Even arguments, apparently, can be settled with feathers. A mother scolds her son, then pulls a feather from her apron and hands it to him. He snorts, but accepts it. Peace feather, she says. Hold it in your mouth and try to shout. You try it later. It works. Mostly because you can't breathe without giggling. One woman confides that she keeps a dream feather under her pillow, a pale bit of swan fluff wrapped in cloth. It remembers me, she says, even when I forget myself. That evening, the village gathers for a seasonal rite. Not quite a festival, not quite a ceremony. A few people wear cloaks decorated on the outside with dyed feathers arranged in patterns, spirals, wings, even runes. Someone juggles feather-stuffed balls for the children. Someone else releases a single white feather into the air, watching it twist skyward until it disappears. You make a wish, you ask. No, she says. You let one go. You lie down later, in your now familiar bedding, wrapped in feather panels that smell like sea air and cedar. You think about all the things these feathers carry. Heat, yes, but also history, belief, memory. You wonder if you'll dream of birds tonight. You hope so. And as the wind whistles gently outside, stirring the feather bundles above the door, you finally understand. Feathers don't just keep you warm. Snow falls like it's been planning this all year. Quiet, heavy, no-nonsense flakes that blanket roofs, horses, and unwatched soup pots alike. The village seems slower, quieter today, not sleepy, just weighed down by the sheer weight of it all. You're inside the longhouse again, watching a man in a dark cloak step carefully through the door. He shakes the snow from his hood and drops a burlap sack near the hearth. With a grunt, he kneels beside it and begins pulling out bundles. Not of food, not of firewood. Feathers. Tax day. He mutters, not quite bitter, but definitely not joyful. That's right. Feathers weren't just for warmth, fashion, and magic. They were currency. You sit up straighter. People paid with feathers? Oh yes, someone chuckles. Still do, in some places. Turns out, the Viking Age feather trade wasn't entirely barter and fluff. In many coastal settlements, especially in Norway and Iceland, kings and local chieftains imposed quotas on households or entire communities. Not of gold or livestock, but of eiderdown. Clean, sorted, and bundled. Feather tax. You're shown a ledger, a wooden tally board with notches carved down one side and tiny feather symbols etched next to each line. 3 sacks per family this winter, someone explains. More if you've got good nesting cliffs. This wasn't just about money. Kings and jarls needed feather-stuffed cloaks and bedding for their own use, but also for trade diplomacy. A well-made down quilt could be offered to a visiting noble, gifted to a foreign ally, or even used to bribe mercenaries into staying warm and loyal. Historians still debate how formalized this system was. Some argue it was an organized tax structure with appointed collectors. Others believe it operated more like a tithe or tribute, expected, enforced loosely, and often negotiated. But the evidence is there. Documents and sagas mention down bundles as royal income. In one account, a king of Norway gifted a German bishop a cloak that required 7 summers of feathers. That's a lot of birds. The man by the fire begins weighing the bundles with a scale made from antler and bronze. The feathers are pressed tight into stitched leather sleeves, marked with wax seals to show their origin. He'll take these to the Jarl's men at the fjord, someone whispers. They inspect every bundle. Shake it. Smell it. Quirky tidbit. There were, apparently, feather frauds. People would stuff bundles with chopped straw or chicken fluff, easily crushed, less insulating, and unmistakably cheap. If caught, punishment ranged from public shame to confiscation of goods. One saga even mentions a woman being tarred in goose muck for trying to pass off goose feathers as eider. You can't help but smile at the image. But also fair. The feather tax wasn't always burdensome. In some villages, it became a source of pride. People would compare yields, boast about their nesting cliffs, even pass down feather rights, like property. If your family had access to a particularly reliable bird island, you were practically rich. You're shown a map carved on a piece of driftwood. It marks out 3 islands, each with notched lines indicating nesting zones. This one's ours, a woman says, pointing. Been in the family since before the eldest stone. Some communities formed cooperatives, pooling feathers and dividing the tax share evenly. Others operated more competitively, but all of them knew that come late autumn, someone in fine wool would be expecting their bundle. And what did people get in return? Sometimes favors, sometimes protection, sometimes, if the stars aligned, a good word at court or an invitation to trade abroad. One man claims his cousin traded a feather quilt for a bronze mirror from Francia. Not even warped, he says proudly. You're handed a sample tax bundle to feel for yourself. It's denser than you expect, compressed tight, but still soft. It smells faintly of salt and hay. The stitching is immaculate, cross-hatched, wax-sealed, and tagged with a carved bead bearing a family symbol, a gull in flight. Every feather has a name, someone jokes. You just can't hear it. Later, as the collector loads the last of the sacks onto his sled, a group of children runs up, trying to barter with handfuls of raw down they've scavenged from the storage loft. That's not tax, the man grumbles. That's lint. They giggle and run off. You sit by the fire again, sipping warm birch tea, and listen to the murmurs of the adults. Some think the quotas will increase next year. The nesting cliffs are becoming more competitive. Birds don't always return. Some fear that colder weather is pushing them farther south. You think of the hours spent collecting, sorting, sewing, all reduced to neat bundles and quiet expectations. But at the same time, it's a system. One that kept people warm, clothed rulers, and linked isolated villages to wider trade networks through nothing more than softness. It's strange, isn't it? The Viking world we imagine, swords and storms and shouting, is just as often about sitting quietly in the snow, tying waxed thread around a sack of bird fluff. You look at your cloak, the seams along your arms, the padding beneath your back, all made possible not just by skill, but by duty, by quotas, by a kingdom built, in part, on feathers. And as the door swings shut behind the collector and the wind rushes in for one last swirl, you feel a fresh appreciation. Softness has rules. Even fluff has taxes. The days are shorter now. Sunlight hangs low, like it's embarrassed to stay too long. You notice it in the way the shadows creep in faster, how the snow no longer melts in the morning, and how even the laughter inside the longhouse has taken on a muffled tone, more comfort than celebration. You sit on a bench near the door, absently plucking stray feathers from your sleeve. Someone brings news. The birds are thinning. Fewer nests were found this year. One of the older islands had almost none. People mutter, eyes lowered, as if the wind might overhear. It's not just a bad season. It's been 3 in a row. At the hearth, a man is reshaping an old quilted cloak, pulling the seams apart, replacing clumped feathers with fresher ones. He sighs as he works. Used to fill this with island fluff in a day, he says. Now I'd be lucky to get half. You ask what's happening. No one says the word outright, but you hear it under every breath. Change. Climate. The winters are still long. The sea is still brutal. But something subtle has shifted. The birds are nesting farther south. Some don't return at all. One elder tells you of strange storms that battered the cliffs midsummer. Eggs scattered like stones. Whole colonies gone in a night. Quirky note. There's a saying in the village. Follow the feathers, find the future. It used to mean good luck. Now it means something else. Something uncertain. Historians today argue whether medieval Scandinavians observed long-term environmental patterns or if their records were mostly anecdotal. But oral histories like the ones you're hearing now, they hold patterns. If not in charts, then in memory, in sighs, in shortened harvests, in worn cloaks that used to be soft. You join a group hauling feather sacks into the community storehouse. Normally, this room would be full, shelves sagging with bundles, sealed and labeled for winter stitching. But now, the shelves echo. There are gaps where there shouldn't be gaps. A little girl reaches for a sack and comes up empty-handed. "They'll come back," someone says gently. But the words hang in the air, unsure. People adapt. They always do. One woman now mixes sheep wool into her linings. Not as soft, not as light, but good enough. Another experiments with hollow reeds stuffed with dried moss. The insulation holds, but the garments creak when you walk. She laughs about it, but you can hear the frustration behind her grin. You visit one of the nesting cliffs again, this time with a different purpose. A family is building a shelter, not for themselves, but for the birds. A lean-to of stone and sod, with walls that block the wind. They'll come if they feel safe, the boy tells you, carefully placing dry grass inside. They just need time. There's something humbling about it. These people, whose ancestors conquered seas and raided kingdoms, now patiently coaxing birds back with kindness. And maybe that's the full circle. The same hands that once plucked nests by the sackful now build them. Some folks get inventive. One woman weaves training nests out of reeds and seals them with leftover feathers, hoping to attract the younger eiders next spring. Another paints a circle of white shells along the cliff edge. They like company, she says, even if it's fake. The line between tradition and innovation blurs once again. New stitches are tried, new feathers tested. A few even explore trading for imported down, costly and not quite the same, but necessary. And all the while, the longhouse adjusts. Garments are patched, not remade. Mittens are shared between siblings. Bedding is stacked with an extra layer of hay. It's not dire, not yet, but it's different. You find yourself helping repair a quilt that's nearly your age. You open a seam and find a note, scratched in old runes on the inside of the fabric. Feathers from the East Cliffs. Year of heavy snow. Worn by my son. May he never freeze. You read it twice. Then you sew it shut, tighter than before. At night, the wind howls longer. The feathers in your cloak rustle faintly as you move. But they still hold the warmth. Still do their quiet work. Fringe belief. Some villagers think that when the birds vanish completely, it won't just be an end of warmth. It will be an end of peace. No feathers, no dreams, one man says cryptically. No softness left to hold the world still. You don't know if he's right, but you understand the sentiment. Because warmth, in this place, is more than body heat. It's community. It's memory. It's the hum of shared labor and quiet comfort. It's feathers, gathered, sorted, sewn, passed down, and now, maybe dwindling. But not gone. Not yet. And as the village prepares for yet another winter, with fewer feathers, tighter seams, and an abundance of stubborn hope, you begin to feel that maybe resilience isn't loud. Maybe it's not fierce. Maybe it's quiet, soft, like a feather caught in the wind, still floating, even as the sky begins to change. The sky today is all white, like a blank page. The snow falls quietly, not in flurries, not in gusts, but in a steady, heavy hush that makes everything feel still. You stand outside the longhouse, your breath trailing upward like thread from a slowly unraveling cloak. Everything around you is feather-muted. The crunch of footsteps, the creak of wood, the rustle of cloaks. All softened, subdued, wrapped in winter's thickest lull. You turn back toward the house. There's a bundle waiting near the door. A cloak, freshly stitched. The last one of the season. You lift it carefully. It's heavier than most, but not from weight. From what it carries. The outer layer is dark wool, wind-tight and woven tightly. The inside is different, quilted channels filled with the last of the eiderdown. Feathers gathered from cliffs you helped climb, from nests you cleared with your own hands. Stitched by women you now call friends, blessed by old men with voices like frost, wrapped with linen threads smoothed with beeswax and bone. And it's yours. You drape it across your shoulders. It settles around you with the softness of sleep, the steadiness of stone. The warmth blooms slowly. No heat rushes in. Instead, it builds, a whisper at your collarbone, a suggestion behind your knees, a hush across your back. You step outside again. The wind is louder now. Not cruel, just impatient. Snow hisses across the ground. Trees groan under its weight. The sea, far off, is a smudge of gray, cracking and seething at the edge of the horizon. You walk toward the outer field. The burial mounds rise gently under the snow, the wind drawing ghost lines across their slopes. There's no ceremony here, just memory. And feathers. You pause before a fresh mound. You know who lies there. She taught you to sort feathers with your eyes closed. Showed you how to stitch panels that didn't clump. Gave you the trick with the ash on your fingers. The one who told you. Feathers are little promises. You break one, the cold hears about it. They buried her in a cloak like yours. No jewels, no gold, just softness and the warmth of flight. You kneel. Say nothing. Just press your hand to the snow and let it rest there. Later, back inside, you hear children laughing. One is running through the house wearing a bundle of old cloaks stitched together, feathers poofing out from every seam like a molting sheep. Someone's scolding him. Someone else is laughing too hard to be convincing. Life hasn't stopped, just shifted. The season closes with quiet traditions. People tighten their seams, share quilts, swap padded mittens for elderberry jam and smoked meat. Everything gets reused, reforged, restuffed. Historians still debate how long these feather customs lasted. Some say they faded with trade and textiles. Others argue they persisted, quietly, in coastal homes and family trunks, tucked between woven linens and stories. But as you sit beside the hearth that night, cloak snug around your shoulders, you know, even if no one wrote it down, it stayed. Feathers don't need books. They live in warmth, in touch, in the hush between cold and comfort. Outside, the storm finally arrives. Snow rushes the roof in soft waves. The door shutters rattle. The wind tries its tricks. But inside, feathers hold. They always have. They always will. And now, as the fire in the hearth fades to glowing embers, your breath slows with it. The last flakes of snow drift lazily past the window, their urgency long forgotten. Around you, the longhouse is quiet, peaceful, a place wrapped not in silence, but in softness. The feathers stitched into your cloak press gently against your shoulders. Not heavy, just present. A subtle reminder that even the smallest, lightest things can hold back the cold. That warmth doesn't have to roar. It can whisper. You imagine the cliffs again. The seabirds swirling in the sky. The nests tucked between rock and sea. The patient hands that gathered what was left behind. The stories that wove feathers into meaning, into memory, into magic. And maybe that's what you carry now. Not just a cloak, not just warmth, but the echo of those who walked these winters before you, who stitched through blizzards, who whispered lullabies into down pillows, who believed, deeply and quietly, that softness is strength. So, wherever you are tonight, curled in bed, eyes drifting shut, fan humming in the background like distant waves, know this. You are wrapped in something ancient, something gentle, something that held Vikings through the darkest nights and still holds you now. Let the wind pass by. Let the feathers settle. Let sleep come, soft as snow. Sweet dreams.